Mine might.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this fast forward planet, which has been very turbulent of late. Most recently in Turkey and Syria, where a pair of devastating earthquakes unleashed, along with hundreds of aftershocks, starting on Monday, early 4 o'clock a.m. local time in Turkey. The last death count I saw was 7,000. I haven't looked at counts of the missing. I'm sure it'll go still further up. And of course, it's a human heated planet. We're changing the climate system. We're, the humanity is surging. I have done too many posts on something. There was an expression by a historian. He said there are many places on this planet that are impossible but inevitable. In other words, they're attractive for economic, societal reasons. They're also dangerous. And I've got a wonderful panel here to explore this. We will start right in with the quake. This is Andy Revkin at the Columbia Climate School, trying to tame the information climate through these sustained webcasts. Just to introduce you to the folks you'll be learning from, we'll be hearing from today. Susan Huff, just below me here, we just arranged to have her come on, thankfully, from Pasadena. You're in Pasadena?
I am. I was at Columbia years ago as a postdoc, but I've been in California for 30 years.
I didn't know that. A U.S. Geological Survey geophysicist studying earthquake dynamics, past, present, and trying to understand the future and how it intersects with human development. Rod Schoonover next to you, who was in the intelligence apparatus for a very long time, under both the Obama and briefly the Trump administrations. He's got a focus on ecological risk and how it intersects with human affairs. Alice Hill, who was in the White House in the Obama era, has a background as a judge, but very much here because of your work on preparedness and responsiveness to big threats, from biological to climatic. And we'll talk about your new book. Alice is a senior fellow, I believe, at the Council on Foreign Relations, among many other things. And Geoff Dabelko, who's a professor at Ohio University and was on the show not long ago talking about blowback. We have to figure out policies. If you're pushing forward on something like climate policy, you don't want to have that create pushback in other ways that stall progress. And Geoff, you're, I think, in Stockholm right now. I couldn't remember. Are you on sabbatical or
yes.
roaming Europe and many other places?
That's right.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here today. I'm going to ask you a series of questions that I had tweeted earlier as well. But I thought we'd start initially with Susan, who's got a very busy schedule. And I just wanted to get your impression of, this drill that sadly is unfolding in Turkey. I've written about big quakes now since 2004. That was the tsunami, and the Sumatran quake was really my first detailed dive into this. 2008, the Sichuan quake, and on, and writing a lot about threats and response or the lack thereof. What does it feel like as a geophysicist working, these faults are here, there, the Himalayan Front Range, Cascadia. How do you wake up in the morning and function with all that knowledge of this terrific hazard that's putting out there?
Yeah, it's a poignant position when something like this happens and you realize the disconnect between what's known scientifically and what the public knows and what the public is able to do in terms of risk reduction. And I've been thinking about the disconnect between geologic time and expectations and you watch these images and your heart just breaks as a parent, as a grandparent, as a human. In a geologic sense, these earthquakes are so expected in some parts of the world. If you look at the seismic hazard map for Turkey, there's a ribbon of high hazard right along the fault that broke in the northern Anatolian fault. So we know they're earthquake zones. But to the public, it's a different time scale. I've heard people say this is a 1 in 100 year event. as if that's rare and unusual. And in a geologic sense, 1 in 100 years is frequent. It's a kind of earthquake that we expect is going to happen. Maybe not in my lifetime, but
Right.
in my children or grandchildren. So yeah, it's this disconnect, and it's hard to feel like you can't do more about it.
I couldn't agree more. And when I wrote my piece the other day, this gets at the superimposition of risks or dynamics. I read a paper from 2018 by researchers who were warning that area, southeastern Turkey, the vulnerability and exposure was enormously increased because of the refugee influx from Syria and other parts of the Middle East. Millions. I think it's roughly 4 million registered refugees. And when I read the paper, I think in our heads, those of us who aren't in the field, we think they're in camps of tents or the like. They're the majority. I think it's something like 80% move into cities, and they're living in crowded. They're not living in fancy high rises. So that's
I'm sorry. We need to be a little bit careful as outside experts about, I don't like to make pronouncements about what Turkey is or isn't doing with their building codes,
Sure.
because that's a very complicated process. They clearly are aware of earthquake risk, and they've taken a lot of important steps. So as bad as the devastation was, if you look at the numbers, something like 1 million people were exposed to intensity 7 or 8 shaking, which is strong enough to flatten a very vulnerable building. But yeah, that photograph, there's buildings in the background that withstood the earthquake, and that speaks to the level of engineering and preparedness that has happened. So the death toll, I believe, is over 10,000. I think it's going to climb. This could have been far worse. This could have been an order of magnitude worse if Turkey, wasn't a relatively affluent country that's building, it's hard to know how to describe it, but they are building modern structures compared to a country like Haiti that doesn't have as many resources for construction. So I think that's an important part of the story.
Yeah, and I hope that at these moments, folks are looking around, whether you live in the Pacific Northwest or care about the fate of Haiti, or I've spent a lot of time focused on the Asian range, the Himalayas, the built vulnerability. There's so much we should be thinking about in terms of our preparedness and resilience. Hey, you just had a paper out recently on Haiti, right?
Yes, looking at an earthquake that happened in 1770, we did a deep dive into the archival sources for that event, which really hadn't been fully mined before.
And what's the message there?
It's not good. The 1770 event, we can't be precise about what happened, but every reasonable scenario includes the faults that are directly adjacent to Port-au-Prince. They're essentially through the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area at this point.
Right.
The 2010 earthquake, as devastating as it was, and that was an example of an earthquake that hit a place that has taken fewer steps towards resilience. The 1770 event was bigger. It shook the Port-au-Prince area a lot harder. 2010, the break itself was to the west of Port-au-Prince. So there is still a nightmare scenario out there for a repeat of 1770.
And I want to stress to folks, if I freeze, which is possible because I'm on Starlink, the satellite system, not on a hard wire, please talk amongst yourselves. And the audience should know I'll occasionally fuzz out. Any reflections from Alice and Rod and Geoff on this? Thinking about the multiple dimensions question, particularly, which is one of our focuses here. I don't know if just raise your hand or shout out.
Well,
Alice.
One of the things I think, and Susan has touched on this, building codes do make a significant difference in terms of both life safety and it can make a difference in the performance of the buildings. One of the challenges after these events is, of course, the rush to rebuild.
Right.
And from what I know, there was a more modern code. I don't know how well it was enforced, but we probably have learned things about even stronger codes since Turkey's last code. And the balancing of the need to get people back into housing, back feeling like they're can return to their lives and that they have a way forward, balancing that against the need to have a safer future can be difficult. And we've seen this repeated across the globe, including in New Zealand and Christchurch. Took quite a while for a variety of reasons to start the rebuild, and many people moved away. So I think it's important at these times that leaders emphasize the greater gains that will come if we can take the moment to register the damage and look at all the solutions that will leave us safer in the past, because we know the cost benefit analysis of risk reduction is very high, including for seismic risk.
That reminds me of something Rod talked about on this show with at least Allison, maybe Geoff, you were on that episode too, about when sort of real-time priorities, getting people rebuilding, being a mayor and saying you're in charge, can take us away from a truly resilient, I don't like to say build back, build forward approach. I seem to remember, Susan, I don't know if you recall, in the Haiti quake, a lot of what was happening was people were moving into the areas that were they were moving onto rubble essentially. Soft areas that will be vulnerable to the next quake. Something like that was happening. I can't remember which geologist was telling me about this. They're really worried about this very phenomenon.
Well, in that case, so building codes are definitely important, but in a lot of parts of the world, not every structure is engineered or built professionally. They're owner built. They may hire a mason or a carpenter themselves. So in Haiti, yeah, there was just such dire emergency needs. People were, and I spent quite a bit of time there after that earthquake, people would pick damaged cinder blocks out of the rubble and use those to construct some sort of shelter because they had to, and they don't have the resources. Where construction is good quality, that gives you a measure of resilience, even without special engineering. So it's the design, it's the engineering, but then it's the quality of construction. And if you just don't, if a country doesn't have the resources to build just basic good quality, that's the worst case for vulnerability.
Yeah, and this brings up something, the cultural element here. After the Nepal quake, and then we'll shift into some of the other hazards in a couple of minutes. I've spent a lot of time over the years talking with Kit Miyamoto, who's an earthquake engineer in California, who runs around the world doing post-quake assessments. And he had gone to Nepal. He took this picture, which was so encouraging. This was after the earthquake. There was a picture of a building that was getting ready to be built. And this very simple thing, the bend in those iron rebar, the horizontal pieces going around the vertical spaghetti strands, if that bend is more than, 120 degrees, there's a particular kind of bend. All you have to do is bend the metal, the end of it, a little bit more, and the building is fundamentally less brittle. And he found this was happening. He saw this on a site, and again in Nepal, where there are building codes, but there isn't a lot of enforcement. So this was a cultural change he was noting, and I thought that's really powerful. And I guess that gets to the leadership idea Alice mentioned too. Communication matters, and I know, Susan, you've been involved in training. There's a whole network of people, global and local. So that feels important too, just public outreach.
Yeah, you need the high level leadership definitely, but there's a boots on the ground element to this. So there's an NGO, Geohazards International, that's been working for years in Nepal. They run training programs for local masons, And they've been talking, I suspect this comes out of work that training programs they may have been doing for a long time, just getting into the field, the people who are building these buildings that, they may not know about the building code, but they're the ones who are putting that rebar in. And so there's a lot that's been done at more of a grassroots level, and that's as important. Yeah, so this is a rare high-rise structure in Kathmandu, I believe. There aren't very many structures like that in the Kathmandu Valley. It's mostly 2 to 3 story structures, and then even smaller buildings away from the city.
Yeah, and here too, he saw this as a success. It's a building obviously very badly damaged, but it did not fall. The floors held, and so much of that pancaking phenomenon we've seen is from issues with preventing those floors from collapsing. There's ways to do that don't necessarily cost more money. They're just different ways of putting things together. Well, Susan, I'd love it if you could hang out a little bit longer, but feel free to pop out if you can't stay longer. And
I have a seminar coming up that, and I can. I don't want to monopolize the.
No, but this is, we're in the middle of it. There's so much happening right now that will. All the issues are on the ground live right now in Turkey and Syria, so it's a good test case. But I do want to get to the wider set of questions, which I had. Oh yeah, here we go. And we'll start making the rounds here, and you can answer them too. Let me just show the screen again. I put them on Twitter, and hoping that others out there will offer their own answers. Yeah, so you've all been on this show before, Susan. I've interviewed many times, so you're in essence in the mix here. So let's review the bidding. And number one is where is it here? Yeah, all right. So we've explored contagion, invasion, climate policy, and more, really in the last 3 years. And I wanted to review the bidding with you. When you look at management preparedness, examples that have emerged, the invasion, the everything that's happening now, has anything changed significantly? Susan mentioned that earthquake damage is less than it might have been 10 years ago, same quake. So what feels different now? Maybe we'll just start with Geoff and go down Alice and Rod, if anything.
Yeah,
we learned anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it isn't new as in unique, but since the last time we talked within the last year or so, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine makes clear that there is critical competition for attention for these crises. And so while COVID is still there, although sitting in Sweden, one wouldn't necessarily know different approaches. But with the war, in competition with the pandemic and the economic challenges that came with that, now we're hearing more about the kind of return of the avian flu risk and the issues that Rod pays so close attention to. I think, and then kind of continued challenges on climate and biodiversity loss that got attention because we had these kind of spikes of attention around the negotiations. I think part of what it continues to be a challenge is competition for resources, and that leadership and attention makes it difficult, even when, like, the Russian invasion of Ukraine makes clear how these issues are connected. And in fact, they're not separate issues, and they're inextricably linked in many ways that have knock-on effects that require that we respond to them in conjunction and frankly, just be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And it's not an either or.
And Alice, for you, what changes have you seen for the better or the worse in terms of how countries or institutions manage this sort of lacework of threats?
Well, I think there's far greater recognition just broadly among the public that catastrophic risk can unfold. We've had examples with the pandemic, and certainly many more Americans are suffering extreme weather, probably fueled by climate change. But I think as Geoff has said, the challenge is still for the leaders. Some of the challenges is that the urgent overcomes the important. So the Ukraine war is the urgent, and now it's all about energy security. Even though we have climate change, which indicates that we have moved much more quickly to cleaner sources of energy going forward. But I think there's another development that has really surprised me somewhat, is this sense of rejection of expertise and rejection of the scientific understanding that we have about catastrophic risk. That makes the job of leaders far more difficult, because they have to contend with people who say that climate change is a hoax, or that getting the vaccine is going to cause the virus to do some strange things to their bodies. And I had not anticipated all of the disinformation and confusion that is sowed in the face of unfolding extremes. And that just makes the kind of planning, preparation, decision-making required to be ready for these events far more difficult going forward, because there just isn't that base understanding of what we need to know.
Yeah, the information environment. I keep saying, if we don't figure out the information environment, the communication climate, we can't hope to deal with the real environment and the real climate. It's become so intertwined. Just one quick question for you before you have to head out, related to what we just were saying. You know, I remember in writing about the quake in Indonesia, and historically in many parts of the world, these were seen as acts of God or nature. We still use the words natural disaster here, which is kind of a belief that it's some external force, almost as if it was God's will. Is that changing?
I think there's a pretty widespread acceptance that earthquakes are a natural phenomenon, that we can understand them. We can't predict them, but we can forecast them. Alice's point was very well taken about some of the other disasters we've seen. I saw an interview with the author of Contagion, which was a very good movie about a pandemic. And he said if he had proposed as part of the story of the movie that the high-level officials would be pushing back with disinformation, he said he would have been laughed out of the room. Nobody would have believed that scenario that we saw play out.
Right.
The one thing about earthquakes is they don't tend to be political. It just hasn't turned into a hot potato the way that some of these other hazards have. So I think the discussion of them tends to be kind of sensible. It's a matter of getting people's attention and bumping up the priority for a hazard that you only face infrequently.
Thank you for that. And Rod, you've dealt with the communicating risk to decision makers through these years. One aspect of, well, I guess one thing I've found, it's important to distinguish between a natural hazard and a natural disaster. I mean, the disaster is up to us. How many people die?
Absolutely.
Buildings, societal imbalance. But thinking back to what we've discussed before, any progress you see? We haven't had a nuclear war, so that's good. Not yet. The last time you were on here, we were discussing the beginnings of this catastrophe that Putin has unleashed.
Right.
What's on?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been on. I think we were on as the pandemic was unfolding in the earliest days, and at the earliest days of the invasion. I think these are two good examples of how, and Susan talked about the disconnect between information and risk navigation. But I think both are also good examples of how the risk profile changes over time with new information, and sometimes it's not information relevant at all. It's just a change in attitude. So, one of the biggest things that I think has happened in the last several years, we're depending on how you gauge risk. We're in the third year of the pandemic, but our risk profile, our risk understanding has changed drastically, right? We've moved from the old, the unknown unknowns to the known unknowns, right? We understand COVID a lot more. We understand, Russia's capabilities a lot more. And so that has a great effect on risk. And so, and as we talk, I think, this afternoon about things that are coming up, right? Things that are emerging, those unknown pieces, and how that when things are unknown and you're experiencing regime shifts, either in societies or the physical world, that really lays the groundwork for blame shifting, snap judgments, and just a whole hotbed of, misinformation and disinformation. And, as we look at more opportunities for surprise coming out of the natural world, right? So earthquakes and seismic activities are not predictable, but we've known about them for millennia, right? But the baseline in some of our other systems is changing. And so, right, the stressor effect is changing. In addition to the vulnerability and exposure pieces that you have talked about at length in the past.
I wanted to thank Susan for joining us briefly in the middle of the work of the U.S. Geological Survey. The next question in my list was, what keeps you up at night in a bad way? Maybe we'll make the rounds on that one. Geoff? Unless I'm freezing. Did I freeze there? Okay. Geoff, what keeps you up at night as a threat we're not really thinking about or dealing with? Anything?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess in some ways it is the threat that underlies all of these, and it's not that it's a new one, but the consistent inability for our political institutions to keep up with the challenges and have anticipatory action that is proactive and heads off or at least lowers the risks for some of these things that are in fact bound to happen, such as earthquakes. But that to me is the greatest frustration and the greatest concern is our inability to respond. The kind of misinformation and willful interest-based diversions and the power of spoilers, often few, who can really scuttle that. So to me, it's in fact, any of these can be and are of great concern, but it's the frustration around the institutional response that really, I guess, gives me the nightmares.
And Alice, when you were on here early on, this is part of, maybe this is still question number one, but it relates to this too. You were talking about your experience in biological preparedness and the importance of running the drill, meaning not just having the plan, not just knowing there's a threat, but running the drill. Are we doing better at that now? But, and in that context, what's keeping you either driving you crazy or you feel that we don't have a handle on yet?
Well, I think we have a lot of challenges, as Geoff has said, and I agree wholeheartedly. One of the most disturbing things is that our institutions cannot keep up with the change, the pace of change, and the types of threats we're seeing. We're always behind. So what keeps me up at night is when I think about why is that? And one of the greatest challenges is that I think human cognition, our ability to understand and internalize catastrophic risk, is remarkably poor because we have all these other skills, cognitive skills, that allow us to get through our daily lives. We're optimists, so we don't think the bad thing's going to happen to us. We tend to evaluate risk based on what we've experienced in past, which is uniquely bad for things like pandemics, even earthquakes over a 100-year period, and climate change. So all of those issues hold us from achieving what we need to achieve in terms of preparedness. Because if we do plan, it's not the plans themselves, as President Eisenhower said, but it's he said plans are useless, but planning is essential. And what the planning does is it runs you through scenarios. It forces your imagination to think through, what if we have the worst case scenario? What would we need to have in place? And then if you can have the discipline to implement those plans, you can make improvements in preparedness. So I think there's a greater understanding of the need for scenario-based testing. We're seeing that in the climate world. We see that in the corporate world, to help us overcome these cognitive biases that inhibit better decision-making for these unique threats that are so big and so unfamiliar.
And Rod, how does that feel, having written a lot of plans and analyses?
Yeah, I mean, that's Alice usually, as usual, hits it quite on the nose, because the future is unpredictable. We understand some general contours of what are coming, but it's really, the military goes through war games. The intelligence community puts on analytic simulations, not to predict the future, but really to look at how human beings and institutions operate when confronted with change, and that builds a self-awareness, potentially, that I think is very valuable when the actual crisis comes. I would also, in addition, I mean, the answers that Geoff and Alice gave were really great. I'd put another one on the map here that doesn't seem to get nearly as much discussion as I would expect, and that's the looming problem of antimicrobial resistance and how the effects of climate change and pollution will almost certainly have on, ushering in a post-antibiotic era. This one worries me sick. We tend to think of AMR, antimicrobial resistance, as something that occurs in the hospital settings or in factory farming, but AMR emerges naturally from the environment. Many pieces of it are temperature dependent. I used a couple weeks last summer to kind of dive into the science, and I was troubled how few people are looking at the intersection between them. If we're hoping that these will just cancel out, or hope for the best, that's a really poor way to plan for the future. And so that's more of a concrete version, but it's something that has really taken up a lot of my thinking in the last 6 months or so.
And does that have the spreadability? Well, I guess on a longer time scale, perhaps, than SARS-CoV-2, but does that blossom into a global threat? It doesn't have that sort of quickness of.
It does, because
it does. Yes, so there you go.
Because bacteria. Let's just talk about bacteria. Bacteria exchange genes between non-relatives through horizontal gene transfer. It's actually the primary way. And so they can and do transfer anti-resistance genes between them. And so something that starts somewhere, for example, Candida auris is a drug-resistant fungi that developed in Japan. And then, within a decade, it was global, right? And so these things, because of the nature of genetic transition between organisms, it is a global threat. These things cannot be contained locally after a little while. And so the state of the planet and the climate and all of its effects and biodiversity loss and its effects, heavy metal pollution and its effects, all are posed and poised to amplify AMR. And that's if you look at history books about the pre-antibiotic era, it's a pretty harrowing possibility. And so that's a very specific example, but one I think about a lot.
Any thoughts on that, Alice?
I just think it's an excellent point. I will say that during the Obama administration, there was an effort in the National Security Council to focus on this. But to Rod's point, the news just keeps getting worse. And we're all at risk. So absolutely, then the interconnection of these risks, do they just compound as we go forward? So it becomes a very distressing and unhappy picture. So we need to always be thinking of ways to help us push on the preparedness and the reduction of risk side, knowing that the risks are growing in magnitude and impact as just with time passing.
So let's move on to what wakes you up early as a glaring opportunity. They're obviously interrelated, but Geoff, you look at the complexities, and I know, like me, you probably go to sleep pretty dissipated sometimes.
Right.
But what wakes you up early is an opportunity that people just aren't hearing about, that we need to kind of.
Yeah, well, I think in many ways it's turning some of those interconnections on their head, just like some of the early environment conflict work kind of started sputtering. And so part of the objective was to turn the hypothesis on its head and ask about environmental peace building. I think the challenges of the interconnected crises also should present the opportunities for interventions that achieve multiple things and have some co-benefits or triple bottom line. One that I've spent a lot of time trying to think about, and we're still challenged by not having a firm evidence base that everyone, of course, says what works and show me the evidence and then we'll go do it. And the response is try it and we'll figure out what works. But is the intersection of opportunities around peace building, poverty alleviation, and response to the kind of climate and biodiversity crises. And so in particularly a resource constrained environment, in many of these contexts where these things come together, there's not kind of conflict prevention day on Monday, climate day on Tuesday, and poverty alleviation. But we don't set ourselves up to do that integrated response, particularly those who have resources that are trying to bring them to bear in these situations. I do think there's real promising prospects for doing that. In many ways, back to the institutional questions, we need to get out of our own way and our silos of funding and who's responsible and integrating our responses, because the challenges themselves are fully integrated. And so making that progress is, I think, absolutely possible and necessary given the connections on the ground.
What you just said brings me to something I wanted to bring up, which is the silos are just such a huge issue. Rod was talking about them before, just within the intelligence community, the different factions that have their own priorities and they're selling them essentially. Last summer, the U.S. government, a bunch of agencies, CDC, NOAA, came out with heat.gov is sort of a resource for for tracking heat forecasts across the country. And I wrote about it, I was lauding it in what I wrote, but I was looking at the research on so much of what you would do in a community to limit heat exposure or impacts is the same thing you would do for cold. And all through the fall, I said, well, where's cold.gov? Or should it just be exposure.gov? And haven't heard back from NOAA. And then we had this polar freezes, and a woman in Michigan, near Ann Arbor, a woman who was disoriented and depressed and had mental challenges, and her two of her 3 children froze to death in a field, not even in the polar vortex, and just a standard cold wave, and the police sort of circled by several times and didn't understand the risk. I see those kinds of examples and it drives me nuts. And I wonder, how do you build the crosstalk? So this is even within NOAA, or CDC. Why wouldn't it be a wider landscape of risk reduction that we look at? I have a feeling heat.gov was driven by, climate change, which we all care about deeply, the heat wave issue. But are we missing something in how we think about these things? And this is for Geoff, Alice, and Rod.
Well, I think we're missing something. I think the Biden administration, in its resilience work, has taken a peril by peril approach. So it's been looking at heat, and then it might look at flood or drought. But as we've been talking about here, they all intersect. And if you live in California, you may have lived in an area that suffered a wildfire and then a drought. And my friend just wrote me and said that because the culvert across the street from her house in Northern California was blocked, her house was flooded in the recent rains. So we need to think about them together. And it's basically all hazards, all whole of government, whole of society, very complex. But if you just pull out one particular peril, as you've pointed out, Andy, then maybe you're just missing the fact that there's lessons to be applied from that peril to other perils to lead to greater preparedness. I think the ultimate goal of the United States should be to have hazard mapping available to every resident that explains to them what their hazards they face, and then helps them engage with their communities, because some of the changes need to happen on a community-wide basis. We don't have that. We don't have decent flood mapping across the United States, and we don't have a central place to get this information. And that seems to me square one. And I'll say the last thing, I think you can't get there unless we adapt the National Adaptation Plan. The United States is an outlier among developed nations in not having a National Adaptation Plan to help us understand who's doing what to prepare for climate impacts.
Yeah, and I would even, I've written a lot about adaptation, and I started to pull back from it toward risk reduction or vulnerability reduction, because it seems to wall off. It seems to create an artificial wall between general climate resilience and adaptation to global warming, and that worries me now a little bit, because it's so many of the things we would do with or without global warming to build a resilient, like think about California, atmospheric river, mega drought. They're all baked into that system. They're part of the California climate. And the science on what climate change will do is still complicated. So it even would build perhaps more bipartisan support if we think about it less as a new need, as opposed to, wow, we built a lot of stuff in areas that are going to burn, going to overheat, going to get too dry. What can we do about that?
I would push back a little bit on that. I think that we do see the word resilience used widely, and it's sort of a safe word, and kind of a mushy word. But you can't really talk about resilience with the changing climate had without talking about what that climate could look like. I mean, let's just take sea level rise or extreme temperatures. Sure. You cannot use historical data and plan for resilience safely now. And that's not widely understood. So I get nervous when we just say, oh, we'll just talk about resilience. And it's like, if you just look at what will happen in the past, that will not keep us safe going in the future. And we need our leaders to understand that and understand that they need access to the information that will inform them of what the future will look like. So the choices they made will be appropriate for that future.
For sure. Thoughts on that, Geoff and Rod?
Well, I'd say it gets to that notion of how the future is not going to look like the past, yet we look to the past to understand the future. And that notion of the new normal and understanding that, whether that's talking to local decision makers as to where to put the wastewater treatment plant based on, looking back on hydrological data, it's just not going to work.
Right.
And so that is the way that in many cases, I'm based in Ohio. It's a state where some are eager to engage on climate change and others are not. But this is talking about change and the practicalities of what it means in a really concrete example at a local level like that is part of the way we try to talk about preparing in a warmer world and not looking back, but looking forward.
Yeah, and build forward again. Build forward better to me. Just saying build back, even that. I think thinking about language in certain ways can be helpful. I find that the prefix "re" it's actually not very useful. Rebuild, revive, it's retrospective implicitly, as opposed to
Well, taking lessons from the ecological world, as I think we should do a lot more of. When ecosystems build back, if they build back to the prior state, they are almost always weaker. And so, the idea that the physics community has landed on is it's not a great term, but anti-fragile. So that you don't build back better, you build towards a state that will withstand future stress, right? So, but
we have to be able to come up with
we tend not to do that. So
no, I know, and that this gets to the norms, the behavioral norms that Alice had mentioned earlier, which was one of my questions. I didn't want to jump ahead, but maybe I will. Alice, you had mentioned some of them before. I think it was you. Status quo bias. Is there some, can we fill in the gaps? I guess this is a question. Is AI and other tools, there's the decision theater work that Arizona State is doing, and where we kind of know what we're bad at. Can technology or other capacities overcome our weaknesses, just like we put on glasses because I can't see very well?
I think so. I think that's one of our great hopes. I don't think it's just handing somebody some information. I think probably we're going to need some human connection to understand that information together. But GIS mapping, artificial intelligence, simulations, you name it, anything that can help make this more real for people. I know there's been games developed so people can understand for the developing world, so they can understand their flood risk or their drought risk. Creativity is definitely required. We have these, we rely on these heuristics, and turns out they're not good for this particular area of having to make choices. So yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity to improve upon the way we have always done it.
Are there examples out there that has come to mind for? I'm actually going to be doing a show next week on visualizing energy with some folks at BU. There's a website now, visualizeenergy.org. And myheat.ca is a Canadian entity that's using data to inspire community change around both adopting renewable energy and knowing where they're wasting energy. I'm hoping they're going to come on my show. They have a mapping tools. Is there something that comes to mind from any of you that feels like it's getting at this possibility?
I'll just throw out two. I think that Climate Central does some excellent work on visualizing and both through graphics and pictures what are the challenges. They did a wonderful iconic series for COP 26, I believe, where they took things like the Taj Mahal or the Capitol and showed what the changes could be to those. And then a very early tool, but I think is still useful, was Cal Adapts, where you could choose different sea level rise portions. So you may have read about Stinson Beach. It had terrible flooding with these recent atmospheric rivers. And if you'd gone on, I happen to have gone on before on Cal Adapts, and they could just show you it's going to be bad there. So the residents who were surprised could have found out. And I'm told anecdotally, people have begun to sell it because they're worried about it before the storm. So yes, but it's all about knowing that it's there and then developing the interest and then explaining what it really means.
You actually just reminded me of more and more real estate companies. Redfin, I think, was the first to have flood risk as an indicator on when you look at a listing on 220 Smith Avenue in Dubuque, and that's spreading. I knew
First Street Foundation did that work. Yeah, excellent work.
Yeah, it's another example. Rod or Geoff, I don't know if any. You don't have to dwell on that, but if there's something that comes to mind that looks like it's really pointing in a direction of actual behavior change or policy change, I'd like to hear about it. The next question was actually about this issue, technology. I've done several shows on AI and Twitter. There was a guy at Twitter, his Twitter tag was Snowman, and he had developed the capacity for anyone around the world to plug into Twitter data to reveal flash flood patterns. Jakarta has a flash flood warning system across the city now that it has a Twitter foundation, because people who are on Twitter are essentially tweeting when such and such a road is blocked, and that feeds back into the emergency management system, and that gives information back to the community too. Another great example. But going forward, maybe what possibilities do you see for technology or other practices to really shift things? And I don't mean just technology, Rod. I mean, like in the situation room, for conversations to happen that are more productive, for example. So we'll just go around on that point before. There are a couple of questions that have come in from readers we can look at too.
Well, I can start. I mean, I'm a big proponent for AI and its ability to add insights. I have a giant asterisk on that because I think, my own experience with OpenAI's ChatGPT-3 has shown a remarkable tendency for this tool to lie, to fabricate. And so, a lot of things that we were talking about earlier in terms of, human behavior, misbehavior, and the capacity to jump to conclusions and not accept expertise. I worry about that trajectory. Just a footnote here. Watching the State of the Union address last night, here in the United States, it felt like some phase transition has occurred that has encouraged what I think would have been universally condemned as atrocious behavior. That is becoming normalized. And that's, I think, representative of, it is itself part of a bigger problem. But it also, I think, really affects our ability to come to a common cause, to common understanding of the risk environment. And then, of course, our ability to solve problems and to scope risk appropriately. I think, that, Geoff opened up with this. I think this is a giant problem that AI cannot fix, but can help with other aspects of understanding the problem. But understanding the problem is a bigger task than we often realize. I mean, we look at so few dimensions of the risk that are presented to us, which means our policy responses are small. And so, I mean, I think that there's a large opportunity for technology to be additive, but there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done, especially where we're showing great weakness in our social fabric, which is also permuting our political fabric.
Yeah, that again, the even at Columbia University, where the climate school exists, my wish is that we really robustly build the school of the social climate. It's there's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. There's a bunch of great climate scientists at Columbia. There are some psychologists and sociologists here and there. There was this Center for Research on Environmental Decision Making, CRED, led by Elke Weber, who moved to Princeton. That NSF funding kind of ended, and we don't seem to put in the support. Even the baseline research funding doesn't seem to be there for that component of these issues. I don't know, Geoff, you're deep into academia.
Well, yeah, I'm nodding as a social scientist who dreams about a fraction of the funding that goes to the natural and physical sciences on these issues, when a lot of what we're talking about here is the shortfall is not necessarily understanding and not necessarily even the intervention or technological response, but it's about how our social, political, economic institutions don't respond in ways that, from that kind of empirical understanding, would be quote unquote rational, right? And so I do think Rod made a point about the kind of scenarios and gaming in part to see how people respond. And I think some of these very specific examples give us greater information and kind of many more people option to see if they're living in a floodplain or if they're at higher risk. I would say, in addition to that, finding ways that we can use that, if you experienced it, you'll believe it, so to speak, and kind of lived experience through the positive, the envisioning what we can transition to in kind of what we're for, not just what we're against, what we want to seek rather than what we want to avoid, and doing that in ways that are maybe using technology to kind of experience that, go through scenarios and games, and find ways that if the challenge is we fear change and we fear the unknown, that finding ways to simulate or get people to experience how being rich in experience rather than consumption is kind of critical for having positive ways forward. As I've found, whether it's in the classroom or at home with my kids, scaring them doesn't give the response that I want to see happen. And so we need that data and that analysis to be informed, but we have to have ways forward. And so if we can take advantage of that, that would, I think, be part of the solution.
Do you all have a few more minutes, or should we have to go?
I unfortunately have to go, but
Okay,
it's been
Alice,
such a pleasure. All right.
Alice, let's do a separate chat on your book, okay?
All right, love
We
to.
didn't get to talk about it.
Thank you so much. All
Thanks
right,
for being
take
here.
care. Bye-bye.
And we'll go maybe another couple of minutes. On the list of things that keep people up at night, I guess Doug Grant brings up aspects of the climate challenge that are different than some of the other issues we're talking about. It's a sustained momentum building process that leads to growing risk of some big bad things that you cannot reverse. So irreversibility is a big deal with climate. Sea level rise doesn't stop because a new president gets elected. And that's there's so many reasons. The momentum is so powerful. So is that also distorting? Is that adequately factored? I know this tough issue with even the social cost of carbon. Where do you draw the line on what's integrated into that number? Is it sea level through 2100? Is it impacts in Bangladesh or just in the United States? So are we distorted in how we look at these threats that you can't like roll it back?
Yes, I mean, of course. I mean, it's almost trite to say it. I mean, the problem with going through phase shifts is that the previous world, in the real world, in physics we call it hysteresis. That state is no longer accessible by turning, by doing whatever you need to do to the stressors. That world is gone now, and so one of my continued critiques of the way that we assess risk, even when I was in the intelligence community, there would be these long, reports, national intelligence estimates, etc. And then there'd be a box about purported low probability, high impact risks. And, oftentimes things like the coronavirus pandemic is listed as those, but their impacts are so consequential that I think that smart people should spend a lot more time in all parts of society thinking about what if that happens, what if we go over some tipping point. And there's a lot of attention, I think, in some of our worlds on these large scale planetary tipping points, and I think they deserve a lot of attention, but there are a lot of smaller smaller level ecological tipping points that are not only possible, they're probable, right? So the development of hypoxia, the development of large scale eutrophication have societal outcomes. And we don't spend nearly enough time getting outside of our incrementalist viewpoint and think about, what does it mean? What does it mean when all states close their borders because of this emergent disease X, right? That is a phase shift. And so yes, we are almost always underscoping risk by putting our incrementalist bias on our perspectives.
Yeah. Well, it's been great to have you both here. Geoff, it's late. It's dark in Stockholm, later there than here. You have more to do. So Geoff Dabelko, Rod Schoonover, thanks for being with me today, and we'll do more. These are perennial issues, identifying pathways forward that don't have blowback, that have wide value, finding ways to identify when smart policies don't intersect. Energy access right now is an urgent need, and decarbonization is an urgent need. Finding how those fit together is still an ongoing challenge. Alice Hill, who was here before, Council on Foreign Relations, and Susan Huff, a great earthquake scientist at U.S. Geological Survey. We're exploring some tough, enduring ways for humanity to do a little bit better to avoid shutting those doors here's this, and I think this was a slide I did for a presentation on Zika back in the day for Costa Rican journalists in Latin America. And that was when Disease X was, there was a paper out about Disease X. And of course, Disease X came. that was what we have seen. So finding ways to understand, integrate around our known weaknesses feels like a really important journey ahead. This is Andy Revkin at the Columbia Climate School Sustain What webcast. More to come. Go to my revkin.substack.com column for more on these issues. And thank you again for being here today, guys. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks, Andy.
And we are pretty much off the air. I think
Cool.
Thanks so much. It was
Yeah.
a good discussion. I'll try to summarize some of it in a post for
Okay.
the blog.
Great. Yeah.
And let me know what's going on. If there's something you want to get out and around, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah. That's awesome.
All right. Take care.